Okay, so the point that the important thing about Pope is that Pope just feels like things should be anchored to reality. And there's so many different ways to do that. And because again, a science fiction movie may have all kinds of aliens and spaceships and all kinds of technology that isn't real and doesn't work and isn't based on reality. But if the emotions are real, if the acting is connected to reality, if the emotions are connected to reality, then I think that's doing something realistic. It's better if it's anchored in some way. Um, I think what a lot of people object to, like I think there's a lot of older people who just don't like cartoons, because not all cartoons, obviously, but there's quite a bit of cartoons that don't seem anchored to anything. They're just like wacky stuff happening all the time, and kids love wacky stuff happening all the time, and it's just crazy and energetic. But like, what a lot of people are asking for, when you hear like older people who seem like they're kind of cynical and they don't really like the stuff that you like, and they don't really like when they're being grumpy about it. One of the things they're being grumpy about is that they feel like, and I'm feeling this now as I get older, is they just feel like there's a lot of stuff that just doesn't feel connected to anything or isn't about anything. Um, and I'll actually bitch about some things that you might like, but like I watched Hereditary, and like it's interesting. Like it's a gorgeous movie. I mean, Hereditary looks beautiful. The acting is great. The music is great. The editing great. But it just didn't feel like it was about anything. It wasn't anchored to any sort of, like, for example, I thought the movie was going to be about things that, the way the past haunts the present, and it just wasn't about that, and it wasn't about anything. It's just a lot of crazy stuff happening, and it wasn't anchored in the same way. A really good horror movie should be anchored to some kind of real problem. And of course, that movie looked like it was about real things. I won't spoil it, but for a long time in that movie, it looked Hereditary. It looked like it was about several different things, the legacies of the older generations on the younger ones, and then in the end, it was just like, no, it's just a bunch of wacky, crazy shit that happened. Bye. So like, there's lots of different ways to anchor stuff. I give you some simple examples, but like, if you punch somebody in the face, it's not going to make a cool sound like it does in the movies. In the movies, there's like a whoosh, whoosh. It doesn't sound like that. That's a special effect for the movies use. So in some ways, every time you watch a movie, when it does like a whoosh, oh, my other favorite one is whenever people take a knife out of a butcher's block or out of a leather holder on the belt. So the butcher's block's made of wood, and you pull the knife out, or you pull the knife out of like a holder in your, I don't know, on your your hip or whatever, and you pull it out like this. It often makes like in Hollywood movies, it often makes this like slicey sound, this like shick. But like, why? Why would it make that noise? Knives don't sound like that when they're coming out of leather or wood. They only sound like that when you rub one knife on another knife. Like, why is it doing that? Um, so there's little, it's, and there's two ways of thinking about it. On the one hand, you could say these sound effects are unrealistic. That's not what it really sounds like when things happen. On the other hand, you could say that stabbing someone or punching someone is a big deal, and the sound effects help to communicate what a big deal that is. And in that case, it's not realistic to the sound, but it's realistic to what a big deal it is. So there's a lot of different ways to think about realism and anchoring your story to reality in some way, or the lived experiences of people. And it's not as simple as, is every little detail and costume and whatever selected 100% exactly what would have been worn back then. It's not just that. And actually, I'll give you a Shakespeare example. Um, I think this is an interesting one, and I think it's interesting because there's not a right answer. It's a debate that people had about Shakespeare costumes, and there is not a correct answer. And somehow they're both realistic and both unrealistic, and you don't know what to do. So here's the question: When Shakespeare wrote his plays in around 1600 in England, but the plays took place in lots of different places. So Hamlet, for example, takes place in Denmark, right? Um, and it doesn't. It takes Shakespeare wrote Hamlet. He wrote it in England in 1600, and Hamlet, the play, takes place in Denmark in the year 1100, right? Um, in the 19th century, which is in the 1800s, they were doing Shakespeare plays, and this question got raised, which is, let's have realistic costumes. But what does realistic costumes mean? Does realistic costumes mean that you want the characters in Hamlet to dress the way actual people would have dressed in Denmark in the year 1100. That would be true to reality. You could do a bunch of historical research and find out what people wore in Denmark in the year 1100, and you could dress them like that for your play, which takes place in Denmark in 1100. Or do you think realistic means dressing, because remember, you're making this play in, say, 1850. Or do you want to dress people exactly how they would have dressed in Shakespeare's day when they were on the stage? Because Shakespeare picked costumes for his actors, but they weren't historically researched costumes. They had their own costuming tradition, and they didn't do a bunch of research on what Denmark was like in 1100. They just dressed them up on what they thought looked good. So you could choose, if you're making this play in 1850, and this was the debate they had in 1850, or really I guess more 1890, but they had a debate about it. Should you dress Hamlet like a real person in Denmark dressed in 1100, or do you want to dress Hamlet the way Shakespeare would have dressed Hamlet in England in the 1600s? In that case, you're not researching historical information about Denmark. You're researching theater history in the 1600s. Or do you want to dress people realistically the way modern day people look? So if you're making the play in 1850, you might want to dress people like it's 1850, since that's who's in the audience, and sort of update the clothes. There's not a correct answer for this. And if someone wants to say, well, it's more realistic to have Hamlet dressed the way a person in Denmark dressed in 1100, you might feel like, well, yeah, but that's not how Shakespeare was. Shakespeare certainly was not thinking about that. They had no interest in realistic costumes in Shakespeare's day in 1600. They just had a crown, and that symbolized the king, and who cares if it was the right kind of crown? So are you going to be true to Denmark in 1100? Are you going to be true to England in 1600? Are you going to be true to modern day? Or are you going to mix and match and do crazy things? And I mean, you guys, I've told you guys to watch Hamlet. There's so many different versions of Hamlet, and they're set in all kinds of time periods. The one that is sort of most faithful, the Kenneth Branagh 1996 Hamlet, is set in like, I don't know, like 1880 or something. So it's not what Shakespeare intended, and it's not what a real life Hamlet would have worn, and it's also not modern day. It's not how they dressed in 1996. He had them dressed like they would in 1896. So like he just picked a time period that wasn't Shakespeare's and wasn't the historical Hamlet's, and wasn't his own time. He just was like, I live in 1996. Shakespeare wrote this play in 1600. Hamlet lived in 1100, and I'm going to set it in 1850 or 1880 or whatever. So it's tricky. But then once he picks, I'm going to make this play look like it's 1880 all the time, are the costumes realistic in that regard? Is that really what people in the year 1880 would have worn? So like and all of that is to some extent realistic, and all of that is to some extent not realistic. So I just want to give you that example because it's a much more complex issue than is that the kind of clothes they really would have worn back then, or is that the kind of speech they were? Because of course the play takes place in Denmark. There's larger issues of realism here, which is like the play takes place in Denmark, but it's not in Danish. They're speaking English. So like there's so many different levels to what I just don't want you to think that Pope is simply it better be realistic or I hate it. And so he must hate all time travel movies, and he must love any movies that are just like a little slice of a person's life as they go through the day. And it's not quite that simple. Pope himself wrote stories that had gods and creatures and monsters in them and things. So it's obviously it's a tricky thing. But I want you to have a bigger sense of it. But Pope's overall point is you got to anchor things to reality. Okay, cool. Hamlet himself has some things to say about theater, and I realize I'm back to the same scene, nearly the same scene that I was talking about last time I was talking about Hamlet, which is when the actors arrive. But in the next video, I'll go over Hamlet's thoughts, because he has some things to say that are very similar to what Alexander Pope says. So we'll take a look at that in the next video.